Hey, it's Dr. Asatar Bear, and today we're going to be talking about unemployment. Unemployment. Right, so unemployment is one of our big three macroeconomic statistics, right? GDP, unemployment, inflation. These are the statistics that most of the time people are going to be referring to when they're trying to assess the economy, talk about how is it, what is it, its health, is it progressing, etc., right? So unemployment is a very important statistic. Um, Now we have a concept which has to do with where is the economy relative to its potential. Okay, so we defined this before, the concept of the potential GDP. Okay, so potential GDP means that the economy is at a position of the maximum output given its resources and its technology. All right, so resources and technology. Remember, when we're saying resources, we're thinking of things like land and capital, and of course, labor. All right. So, and when we think of technology, we're thinking of the way that we produce output, the way that we produce goods and services. So Keynes uses another term to refer to this, right? Because Keynes is writing at a period a little bit before the development of these statistics. He has the concept, right? Economists talk about all of these concepts beforehand, before the statistics were actually developed, right? So Keynes calls this potential GDP the full employment level of output, or simply full employment. All right, so a lot of times in Keynesian economics, you'll see this term used, right? Full employment. Now, it's a little bit confusing because this does not actually mean that the unemployment rate, which we're going to get to that, what that statistic is, it doesn't actually mean that the unemployment rate is zero. Okay, so to understand this, we need to distinguish between different types of unemployment. Types of unemployment. All right, and this is following the discussion in Keynes' general theory. So Keynes argues that, look, first of all, there is a type of unemployment which is frictional. Okay, frictional unemployment. Now, frictional unemployment refers to a time lag between job loss and finding a new job. All right, so it's like when somebody says, "Oh, I'm between jobs right now." Right? That's the concept. Okay, they have either left a job or been laid off or been fired. It doesn't matter, right? Whatever the way that you've experienced job loss is, now there's some time period where you're finding a new job. Okay, so think about this, right? If we have a labor force with hundreds of millions of people in it, well, there's going to be, even if the time lag itself is very short, there's going to be some people who are in that time lag, right? Like, even if, let's say if the size of the labor force is 365 million people, for example, right? And even if it only takes you one day to find a job, well, there's going to be a million people who are, if that's their day, right? They lost their job, and it's taking them one day to find a job, right? So, the frictional unemployment is some part of this whole thing, all right? So, in the U.S. economy, frictional unemployment is perhaps somewhere between 1 and 1.5%. All right, somewhere in there. Okay. So the second type of unemployment is structural. Okay, structural unemployment. So structural unemployment also has to do with a time lag, but this one is due to structural change in the economy itself. All right. So structural change in the economy means that there's going to be some industries which are going to be going through a job loss in that entire industry, right? That is, the number of jobs in that industry is going to be declining. Okay, so example, in the United States, like many industrializing economies, one of the big industries which was super important in industrialization was the textile industry. Okay, so textile industry is a very important industry historically. This is where the Industrial Revolution began, right? But as many economies mature, including the United States shifted out of textile production. And so this industry has seen a large degree of job loss, especially relative to the other sectors of the economy. Okay, so some sectors, some industries are going to be experiencing job loss. But then, of course, there's going to be job growth. That is, the number of jobs is going to be rising in some other industries, right? So, like for example, we might look at something like, anything that is web related, internet related kind of technology, right? The fact that you could be a web designer, okay? So you go back to the 1980s, that's not even that long ago in the grand scheme of things. That wasn't a thing, right? All right. So the point is there's all kinds of new jobs that are related to this job growth in that industry. Okay, so now this implies that there's also going to be a similar kind of thing going on here, right? There's going to be a time lag between, right? Okay, there's new jobs over here in this industry, but if you've lost your job over here, it's going to take you some time to find a new job. To workers have to gain new skills in order to go from one industry to another industry, right? Um, and that's going to produce a certain amount of unemployment. Okay, so again, perhaps it's somewhere between 1 and 1.5%, right? Now, the reason I say that, these are back of the envelope types of calculations. The reason I give that range is because the U.S. unemployment rate has never been below 2.9%, right? So somewhere in that range, right? That's the minimum historical figure we've observed. Okay, so the third kind of unemployment, the third type of unemployment, is called cyclical unemployment, right? And this means it's due to a recession. Okay, so the term cyclical refers to the business cycle, and we're talking about a downturn in the business cycle. All right, so downturn in the business cycle, and this makes unemployment increase. Okay, so the goal of Keynesian economics, all right, Keynesian economics seeks to eliminate this third type of unemployment, right? This cyclical unemployment, right? Because that's seen as the kind of good management, good regulation, good stewardship of the economy, is to manage it so that we are at a full employment equilibrium. That will not necessarily happen by itself. We can't really do anything about the fact that there's going to be these time lags, right? Frictional and structural unemployment is going to exist, okay? However, we can do something about this cyclical unemployment. So, example, if we see that unemployment is significantly higher than, maybe somewhere in the 2 to 3% range, right? If that's about the minimum that unemployment can be in an economy, something around that, all right? Again, it's not an exact type of thing, okay? So what we mean by full employment is the unemployment is at its absolute minimum level, okay? So somewhere in this 2 to 3% range, okay? That would mean that the cyclical unemployment would be zero, okay? So obviously the cyclical unemployment can be significant, okay? So example, in the last big recession, I'm recording this video in March of 2020. So, the last big recession is the Great Recession. The Great Recession of 2008 began in late 2008. So during this period, the unemployment rate went up to just about 10%, a little bit under 10%. All right. So we can see if the frictional and structural unemployment is perhaps 2 or 3%, we had a lot of cyclical unemployment during this period. Okay, and by the way, during this time, unemployment stayed high for an unusually long period of time. Uh, all right, unemployment, it stayed elevated. It didn't stay at 10%, but it stayed above 7% for 5 solid years. That's very unusual. Okay, we haven't seen a period that has elevated unemployment like that since the Great Depression of the 1930s. So that's partly what justifies this term here. All right, next thing we're going to look at is calculating the unemployment rate. Okay, so in order to calculate the unemployment rate, we have to settle a couple of important matters, right? So unemployment rate, like any rate, it refers to the number of people who are unemployed relative to the total, right? So the issues that come up when we're talking about unemployment is what is the relevant total? Okay, what is the number that we should divide by, right? Like example, okay, we have a U.S. population of about 327 million people, right? 327 million people. Well, is that the number that we should be dividing by? Here's the thing, right? A lot of these people are, below. What about children? Okay, like what about those who are below, say, age 16, right? Should we not take them out, right? If we take them out, we're going to get a smaller number, right? So a lot of the issues around unemployment are what is the relevant number that we should consider? What is the relevant population? Okay, so we're going to take out anyone under age 16. Okay, we're going to take out children, and we're also going to take anyone who is in an institution. Okay, those who are institutionalized, institutionalized persons, right? So, we're also going to take out anybody who is in the armed forces, right? So, take this number and make a couple of subtractions. And when we do that, we're going to arrive at a figure called the civilian non-institutional population. All right, and as of February 2020, it's the last statistics that I have available to me for this video. As of February 2020, the civilian non-institutional population in the United States was 259.6 million people. Okay, so you can see we've trimmed it down quite a bit, right? We've taken out tens of millions of people because they don't really fit with our contemporary notions of who really should be employed, right? Do we expect children below age 16 to be working? Not really, right? At this point in history, we expect them to be in school, right? And the same thing with people who are in prison or, in the hospital, or et cetera, right? Institutionalized persons, people in the armed forces, well, they have their duties already, right? So the civilian non-institutional population, that's the relevant size group for us, okay? Now, we have another issue, okay, which is that not everyone in this population actually wants to work, right? Now, is it not a free country? If you don't want to work, are we going to say you're unemployed, right? Unemployed has something to do with that you would like to work, right? So there's not all of this population is even relevant, right? So we're going to refine it a little bit more and say of this, there is a subset of it called the civilian labor force. All right, we'll use the term LF to refer to the labor force. Okay, so the civilian labor force. Now, what does it mean to say that you're in the labor force, right? Because now it's starting to become kind of amorphous. Now, I'll say why in a sec. Okay, so here's how we define the civilian labor force. All right, we define this by saying this is the number of people who are employed, right, plus the number that are unemployed. Okay, number employed plus the number unemployed. And that gives us a much smaller figure, okay? Now, to get to the number employed, we have to answer a number of basic questions like, what exactly do we mean by employed? Like, what is an actual job? Okay, so the way that we define this is we're talking about paid labor outside of the household. All right, paid labor outside of the household. So it has to be a form of labor for which you receive some kind of payment. It doesn't have to be wages. It could be tips. It could be there's lots of different forms of compensation. It could be commission, etc. All right, so paid labor outside the household, that's what we mean by employment. And then unemployment, well, this has to be defined as well, right? Because if we're talking about unemployed, that means, what does that mean exactly, right? I mean, what if you have a job but it's not a job you want, let's say, right? Well, you're not unemployed, okay? We're going to define this as having no job, okay? But you want a job, right? You want a job, you're available to work, and you are actively seeking, right? You're actively seeking employment, otherwise known as a job, okay? So you have no job, you want a job, you're actively seeking a job, and final piece, you have to have been actively seeking a job sometime in the last 4 weeks, okay? In the last 4 weeks. All right, so that is what we are defining. All of these conditions have to be met. It's kind of stringent, right? All of these conditions have to be met for somebody to be considered unemployed. All right. Employed means paid labor outside of the household. Okay. All right. So if we look at this, we can find the civilian labor force is actually a lot smaller. Okay. So our latest figure for the civilian labor force is 164.5 million people. All right. So including the employed and the unemployed. All right. The employed is 158.8 million, and the unemployed is 5.8 million. Okay, so now we can arrive at how do we actually calculate the unemployment rate. Okay, so the official unemployment rate, okay, unemployment rate official, comes from this statistic. This, in the numbers, this is known as the U3. Okay, so, and anytime you see the word rate, it tips you off that we're looking for a percentage here. Okay, so the unemployment rate is arrived at by taking the number that's unemployed, all right, that we just had that over here, right, 5.8 million, and dividing it by this civilian labor force. Okay, so in our example, we're going to have this 5.8 million divided by this number right here, right, the 164.5 million. Okay, now the millions drop out, so we don't have to mess with that. Oh, and it's multiplied by 100. Okay, so when we do that, we get 3.5%, which is the official unemployment rate for February 2020. Okay, so this is how the unemployment rate is calculated. Now we also have another statistic which is relevant here. Okay, this is called the labor force participation rate. Participation rate. Okay, so labor force participation rate is related. It's a related statistic, right? We have a labor force, civilian labor force, that is smaller. It's a subset of this civilian non-institutional population, right? So it is the participation rate is the size of the civilian labor force relative to this entire civilian non-institutional population. Okay, so the 164.5 million divided by this 259.6 million, and this gives us a 63.3% for our labor force participation rate, or simply the participation rate. All right, so in terms of where does this data come from, okay, the data comes from surveys. All right, we've got two surveys. We've got a survey of employers and a survey of households. Okay, the survey of employers is 145,000, and the survey of households is 60,000. All right, so really big survey data. They also use employment data that comes from that comes from the IRS and so forth. So the entity that tracks this is called the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Okay, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and we're going to take a look at some of their data. You can find there online at bls.gov. Okay, and the unemployment statistic goes back to 1948. Okay, the creation of a special government agency, which is, that tracks statistics related to employment, productivity, unemployment, and so forth. They also calculate the inflation rate. That's what the Bureau of Labor Statistics does. Okay, and they do a large survey here. Okay, the reason that they have to survey households is because they're looking for information which isn't really that easy to obtain, right? Employment is one thing, right? That just has to do with the number of jobs. Once you define what a job is, that's a little bit easier, right? But how many people are unemployed, right? Those people are not at the job, right? They're in the overall population. How do you know how many people want to work, right? The only way you know that is you have to actually ask them. So this is what the survey data does, right? The survey data is, the large survey. So keep in mind, a survey of 60,000 is a huge, huge survey. Okay, a typical survey, like for example, when it's political season, whenever we have political polls that say, what's the percentage who support this or that candidate, or who view a candidate favorably or unfavorably or whatever. A poll is typically based on a sample size of about 1,000. Okay, so the nationwide polls that make the news headlines or whatever, 1,000 people. All right, the Bureau of Labor Statistics does a survey of 60,000 households, and they do this each and every month. Okay, that is a huge, huge undertaking. Now you might say, well, 60,000, gosh, that's still pretty small relative to the whole population of the United States, right? Like, I mean, these numbers are much larger, right? The total population, 327 million, the civilian non-institutional population, almost 260 million. I mean, how can a survey of this size tell us anything, right? Well, keep in mind, the typical survey is much, much smaller, right? 1,000. And the way that this works, of course, is if we collect a random sample, we can use that random sample, or if it is truly random, then the odds are that it is going to reflect the total population, right? Within a certain margin of error, all right? There is a statistical margin of error because we're randomly selecting a small subset of this group, right? And saying, well, how does it then, is it accurate relative to the average within this population? And what surveyors, what social scientists have learned is, yes, it is, right? This is the study of sample statistics or inferential statistics. All right, so surveys work, right? The only question is, how do we make sure that it is random? Okay, that is the key question. And a lot of surveys actually deal with the same type of problem, which is that, how do you actually contact people? Okay, so a lot of times the surveys of the past, right? So surveys often rely on phone calls. And this worked for a long time, right? Because phone calls, it used to be that if you called somebody on the phone, even, just randomly, right? You randomly select their phone number and call them up. It used to be that this person had about a 90% chance of being willing to answer your questions, right? Answering the phone and answering the questions, 90% chance. That's changed a lot, right? That's gone. The modern survey has only about a 10% chance of being answered. And, like we're kind of over it. When it comes to phone calls, we've gotten a lot of phone calls, right? A lot of telemarketing and, just what we were over being called randomly. And so it's actually harder to get people on the phone. It's harder to get people to answer questions than it was in the past. That's a little bit of an issue because, again, this whole thing rests on that the sample is random. So if there's some character, if a small proportion of people actually answer surveys, which is the case, it's a little bit less clear that, do they have something in common, right? Because it's easy to see how this could start to become non-random, right? Okay, but let's assume that, the Bureau of Labor Statistics has, thousands of very smart people working for them, right? They do nothing but think about how to make this sample random, right? So let's assume that they are doing their job correctly, right? I just want to point out that this is a massive undertaking, right? It's much larger. It's the reason that surveys use 1,000 is because it's expensive, right? If only 10% of people answer the phone, right? Think of you have to make thousands of calls just to get 1,000, right? Um, so the Bureau of Labor Statistics has to do this too, but they're willing to spend the money, right? Because they're funded by the government. Other thing we see in terms of the data is that unemployment rates differ quite substantially by race, by gender, by age, and by education. Okay, these are the categories that the Bureau of Labor Statistics tracks. Okay, so let's say example. Okay, let's take the race one. All right, so we have a unemployment rate for whites. Okay, which is in the latest numbers 3.1%. Okay, versus we have an unemployment rate for African Americans, which is nearly double. Right, 5.8%. So there's something here about the history of slavery, right? I mean, African Americans were enslaved and brought to this country against their will, right? Under slavery, there really wasn't a thing called unemployment for slaves, right? A slave was an owned piece of property. Their masters made full use of them, right? There were no unemployed slaves, okay? So after the Civil War, slavery ended. We had the Jim Crow system, we had segregation, and we had the racism which persists to this day. And we can see that in basically all of our economic data, right? All of our large macroeconomic statistics have racial differences built into them. Okay, so we just want to point out, right? This has nothing to do with differences in whites or African Americans wanting to work, right? Everybody who is in this number wants to work, has been actively seeking employment in the last 4 weeks, doesn't have a job, right? There, those four things that I mentioned. Okay, so this has to do with discrimination in labor markets, right? That's the only explanation we have for it. We know that exists. All right, so and we can see it, of course, with the other categories that the Bureau of Labor Statistics tracks. They have a category called Hispanic or Latino. This one is also elevated relative to the white level. Like this one's 4.4%, and then the other category that they track is Asian. This one is actually lower. Right? Interestingly, this probably has something to do with the history there as well, right? The Asians, many of them were brought to the United States as temporary workers, right? So building the railroads, we have many different examples of this. All right, so unemployment statistics by race. We can look at it by age as well. So one of them we have a teen unemployment rate, that is people who are 16 to 19, and this one is also a lot higher. All right, this is 11%, right? One of the highest rates of unemployment we see in any of the subcategories. Um, Okay, if we look at it in terms of education level, okay, so uh, for those who have less than a high school degree, uh, the unemployment rate is much higher, all right, 5.7%, versus for those who have some college, okay, or an associate's degree, right, an AA degree like what you would get at community college, for example. If you have that, the unemployment rate 3%. Okay, those who have finished college and have a bachelor's degree or higher, okay, a bachelor's degree or higher, have a 1.9% unemployment rate. Okay, so there are very big differences in terms of the unemployment rate by these different categories that the Bureau of Labor Statistics tracks. So let's go back to the definition of unemployment, right? You are unemployed if, right, this is important, okay? You have no job, all right? You want a job, you're actively seeking, and you have done that in the last 4 weeks. All right, so for years, the Bureau of Labor Statistics has received criticism over their measure because people have said, well, what if there are some people who have jobs, but the job is not good enough? It doesn't provide them with enough of an income, enough of a living that they need, but they do have a job, so they're not unemployed. So in 1994, the Bureau of Labor Statistics made a couple of changes to the way that they track these numbers, and they began tracking a new piece of data. Okay, that is those who are employed part time for economic reasons. Okay, that is they want full time. They want a full time job, but that's not. They weren't able to find one. Right there, there's not enough work for them. Let's say, or the best that they could find was a part-time job. Okay, so they started to track part-time for economic reasons, and in the current survey, there's actually 4.3 million people who fall into that category. Once they start asking the question, they found, wow, that's actually huge, right? 4.3 million people. I mean, remember the total unemployed is about 5.8 million, right? So, you know, this is this is a pretty big number here, right? Um, that's it's a huge number, millions of people, right? Now they also tracked another number, which is they called marginally attached to the labor force. Okay, LF, labor force. So now this looks at these two. What if a person meets some of these criteria but not others, right? So to marginally attached, they have no job. They meet that first one. They want a job. They're available to work, and they might have even been actively seeking, but they haven't been actively seeking in the last 4 weeks. So there's they either don't meet both of these, or they don't meet just this one. Okay, that makes somebody marginally attached to the labor force. What this means is this person is not in the labor force because again, you got to meet all of these in order to be unemployed. If you don't meet the last two or the last one, then you're not unemployed. You're just not in the labor force. Okay, so this group is not in the labor force. The Bureau of Labor Statistics didn't count them for a long time. They started counting them based on, they had to add some questions to the survey. And they did that and they found, well, even with a very low unemployment rate, right now the unemployment rate is fairly low, 3.5%. There's still 1.4 million people who fall into this category, right? That's a pretty large number of people. If we added them, that would change the unemployment rate. Okay, we have a subset of this group which is called discouraged workers. All right, so discouraged workers is a part of the marginally attached workers, a part of this 1.4 million. It's about 0.4 million. So discouraged workers say, look, they don't have a job, they want a job, they stopped seeking because they didn't think that there was work available for them in their field or whatever, right? They gave a labor market related reason for not seeking employment. Okay, that makes you a discouraged worker according to the BLS. Okay, so the point is, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the unemployment rate is one of the most politicized statistics that there is, right? I mean, all of these are actually, but the unemployment rate in particular is used by anybody who is critical of the way things are going, right? So anyone who is running for political office who wants to criticize the incumbent, say we need something new, they will point out, they'll dig into the unemployment statistics. If the unemployment rate is low, they might say, well, yeah, well, it should be a lot lower, uh, or it doesn't count these marginally attached, right, or discouraged workers, or well, what about the people who are working part time, etc. Okay, so here's a history of the unemployment rate going back through the entirety of the series, right? The unemployment rate officially begins in 1948. Now we can see there are these periods where the unemployment rate peaks, okay? So see this? Unemployment rate peaks and then falls. And these are associated with recessions. This is the thing I talked about before, the cyclical unemployment. All right, so here is the Great Recession that I mentioned, right? The unemployment rate shoots up very rapidly, right? That's all of these have pretty rapid increases, right? Um, but this one goes from a pretty low level to a pretty high level very quickly, right? So we go from about 4.2%, 4.5% unemployment to just under 10% very, very quickly. It takes the unemployment rate a long time to fall, right? There's a 5-year period where the unemployment rate stays above 7%. That's high by historical standards, okay? The average unemployment rate is about 5%. If we look at the whole of the series, okay, like as far back as we have it, about 5% is about average. So anything below that, like we're below that, okay, so 3.5%, well below the 5% mark. Um, that would be considered low unemployment. Anything above 5% would be considered elevated. All right, let's take a look at the labor force participation rate as well. Okay, so again, we have the whole series here, and we can see going back to 1948, right? What happened is the labor force participation rate started off low because we're in a period where in the 40s and 50s, we're in a period where, the single wage earner per family, you had a kind of a family wage. That was the history, the understanding at the time, right? The labor force participation rate begins to rise as women enter the workforce, which they begin to do in the 1960s. You can see this happening, right? The rise of feminism, of women, working outside the household for the first time, and that causes the labor force participation rate to go up substantially. Okay, so by the by 2000, this process had reached its peak. Okay, so we had gotten the absolute highest labor force participation rate that ever been recorded in this data. Okay, about 67%, 67.3%. Now, by the time we get to the beginning of the Great Recession, this has fallen some from its peak about 6 years earlier. Right, it had fallen some to about 66%. 66.1%, right around that level. All right. Now, what happens as the Great Recession unfolds is millions of people drop out of the labor force, right? The labor force participation rate goes from 66 down to a low of 62.4, okay? So, and this represents about 10 million people drop out of the labor force. Now, one of the issues with this is when people drop out of the labor force, then they're no longer counted, right? So they are not considered unemployed when they leave the labor force. So that's an issue for the measure, right? There's some people who are made invisible by this, right? And so the question that we would have to ask then is like, why did this happen, right? This is actually a pretty huge movement. Okay, why did this happen? Now, some part of the answer is that people retired, right? The baby boomers started to hit retirement age around this time. Some of them, baby boomers is kind of a, it's a range of ages there. Um, some of them retired, yes, but some people dropped out of the labor force for cyclical reasons. Okay, that is because they just couldn't find a job, and so that's of concern to us. All right, um, and only some of these people have come back. Right now, the labor force participation rate has come up. Okay, so our latest statistic, 63.4 rate, has come up a percentage point since its absolute low. Uh, but it hasn't returned to anything like its previous peaks. Okay, so here we have what the BLS calls the alternative measures of labor underutilization. Okay, so the official unemployment rate, like I mentioned before, is known as the U3. Okay, so U3, total unemployment as a percentage of the civilian labor force, that is the official unemployment rate, right? And our most recent figure is 3.5%. Okay, so because the Bureau of Labor Statistics had received so much criticism over the years, uh, they made some changes to how they reckon this. Okay, so they said, look, what if we were to count the total unemployed plus the discouraged workers, right? Plus the discouraged workers. Remember, about zero point 0.4 million, okay? And then look at that as a percentage of the civilian labor force. If we do that, what we find is the unemployment rate is slightly higher, okay? We added nearly 500,000 people, um, and we get 3.8%, okay? Now, oh, and by the way, this measure is called the U4, okay? So the the BLS actually tracks 6 different measures of unemployment. The official one, that's like kind of the headline one, right? The U3. U4 adds in the discouraged workers. This is the way that they dealt with the criticism, right? Because a lot of economists said, well, what about people who want to work, but they just don't think they can find a job, right? Um, they're not counted at all. It's like they're invisible. And so the BLS said, all right, fine, you want them? Okay, we'll create another measure. And they did this in 1994. Before that, they only used to have, the one measure. So then they multiplied them. Um, all right, what if we add not only the discouraged, but we add all the marginally attached to the labor force? Okay, we do that, we come up with another measure that's U5. Okay, U5 significantly higher, right, 4.4%. But the really big ticket item is, what if we add all the unemployed plus everything else, right? The um, the marginally attached, the discouraged, uh, and also those who are employed part time, but for economic reasons, right? Part time for economic reasons, because we know there's millions of those, right? Then we get 7% here, okay? 7%. U6 is the broadest measure of unemployment. And the thing about this, right? So basically, okay, the critics were correct, right? The critics pointed out that, look, if you count these people who are, part-time for economic reasons, the discouraged workers, the marginally attached workers, if you count them, you're going to end up with a much higher unemployment rate. And look, it's double, right? It's 3.5% low unemployment. It's 7% if we count the rest of these people, right? Which we probably should, right? Working a part-time job when you need a full-time job, you shouldn't really call that employed, right? You should call that at best half employed. But see, that's not a category. So this is why they use the term, Bureau of Labor Statistics, they're very technically finicky, They use the term labor underutilization, meaning the labor is underutilized, right? This is not technically unemployment because, again, the definition of that is you have no job and you want one, you're actively seeking, you've sought it in the last 4 weeks, okay? So a person with a part-time job does not meet that technical criteria. So this graph zooms in a little bit and looks at this period from the mid 1990s, this is January 94, to the beginning of the Great Recession, when the unemployment rate starts to really zoom up. Okay, it's beginning in 2008, mid part of 2008. By the time we get to January, very beginning of 2009, the unemployment rate has really shot up, well above where it was. Right, so it went from 4.5% to, well, by the time we get to January, we're at 7%. Right. By the time we get to the middle of 2009, we're at 10%. Okay, so this is the U3 right here. All right. Now, here's the thing that we want to keep in mind, right? If we look at what is the difference between the U3, that's the official measure, and the U6, which is our broadest measure, look at how closely these measures track, right? I mean, it's like I basically copied this and pasted it above it, right? I mean, they're almost identical, and that's because the U3 is in the U6, right? So we expect this. It makes some sense to us that because the U6 includes this one, but it also includes other stuff, right? So the U3 was to increase, and the U6 didn't increase all that much, right? Then okay, that'd be interesting. But because so when the U3 went up to its highest level, okay, about 10%, look at this. The U6 also shot up, right? What does this tell us, right? It tells us, like, okay, not only are there more people who are unemployed, but there's substantially more people who dropped out of the labor force, who became discouraged, who moved from being in the labor force to then being marginally attached. That's the only way this measure can increase this much, right? Uh, Millions of people dropped out of the labor force for economic reasons. Okay, that is, in other words, that's cyclical unemployment. Here's the thing, right? We want our official measure of unemployment, or we want that to actually measure all the unemployment that's relevant, right? We don't want people to drop out of the labor force and then stop existing for the purposes of the measure. Okay, that's bad, and there's evidence that that is happening, right? So probably what we should do, I mean, we have a kind of an easy solution here. We should probably just be using the U6, right? That's our broadest possible measure of unemployment. There isn't really a downside to using it, right? It's a better measure. It's tracking stuff that the official measure is not tracking, right? Um, so I think that's a mistake to not track that, right? The Bureau of Labor Statistics was correct to add these things, right? Or the critics were correct to insist on adding these things. We should actually use it, and the U6 should get a lot more attention in the media. All right, that's my presentation on unemployment. Thank you very much.